Ladies and gentlemen, something strange has really happened. And that is, the EFF just had its annual conference. And some of the most spicy parts about it were just ignored by the media. So let us actually have a look and see what's gone on. So during the conference, Malema stood up, and I must say that my impressions of Malema is that he looked really sickly. Many people have speculated as to why he looked sickly. And the speculation has ranged from drugs, some people speculating that he's on the little bit of the sniff, and other people have speculated that possibly it's AIDS. What the real story is unknown to most. But in any case, what we can tell is that Julius Malema did not look well. And actually, to a large degree, that was ultimately the theme of the conference, a very sick and limping EFF trying to regain forms of relevance. Now, in typical fashion, how did that attempt to regain relevance actually go? Yeah, it was predictable. Was Malema calling for violence against white citizens? His exact message was, our message is simple. There cannot be unity and reconciliation in South Africa without justice, and justice will be violent for those who are comfortable at the expense of African people. Ultimately, there will be a need to take up arms. Yeah, he literally goes to town and says that he's basically calling for war against the white population. And we've seen this kind of rhetoric from Malema before. And usually when this rhetoric comes out, well, ultimately he lands up in the news. But in this instance, he didn't. In fact, most people ignored him. Now, the first relevant question should be, will the South African Human Rights Commission step in, actually investigate the calls to violence, and will they ultimately sanction Malema, remembering that he is still the leader of the fourth largest political party in South Africa? And I must say, ultimately, as a betting man, I wouldn't take that bet, because ultimately the South African Human Rights Commission is very selective around the cases that it wants to take. Now you may ask the question, why is it selective around the cases it wants to take? And actually the answer is a lot easier than you might think. First of all, the Human Rights Commission ultimately, obviously, for to pursue actions of litigation, well, it's effectively going to cost it some money because litigation isn't free. And the South African Human Rights Commission, being a Chapter 9 institution, doesn't have an endless amount of funds. The second reason is because Malema likes to act slippery when challenged on the things that he says. What he would inevitably say is that actually his calls for violence, his calls for war, were made in the economic sense. He would say, what I actually mean is that what I'm saying is that people should, be involved in peaceful forms of violence. And what that means is we just won't support their companies, or we'll shout at them a lot and put them under increased political pressure. And you see, this is the type of slippery logic that Malema likes to use. He typically tends to use this logic in order to avoid accountability. And the problem is that when it usually goes before the courts, remembering that what we're ultimately dealing with is a burden of proof that is beyond reasonable doubt, that means that you don't really know from a judicial perspective whether there is a degree of doubt as to what he's actually saying. Is it nothing more than political polemic? Or is this actual legitimate speech where he's saying very clearly that he wants to antagonize a form of race war, if you will? And ultimately, the way this usually tends to come down is on the side of the person who's hearing it and what they actually hear and take from that messaging. Some individuals may interpret it literally to say, well, we need to fight for the EFF. And others may say, it's just Malema being Malema. It's a little bit of a political speech. And ultimately, the problem becomes in what we would typically refer to as reckless delivery of speech. Because you see, the recklessness means he's not actually giving his polemic the appropriate degree of thought in order to ensure that it doesn't get misinterpreted. To a large degree, he wants to be misinterpreted because you see, the misinterpretation allows him to claim a degree of relevance. And we usually see that in the media class. But in this instance, we didn't. What we actually saw is that the media class just ignored him. And possibly this shows the constant decline of Malema and his constant decline in relevance. It's safe to say that he hasn't really been seen in public much this year. And certainly since Floyd Shivambu left the party, he's looked a very somber individual, with individuals, key players in his party, such as Ndlozi, being excluded from the top leadership, the NEC of the EFF, if you will. And all of this paints a very negative picture of Malema and his party. What it shows is that no one really cares about the EFF anymore. And in order to try claim some form of relevance, Malema has gone out and done the predictable, and that is, he's used racial language that he intends to use in order to create almost forms of fake outrage. Because once that outrage starts, he will claim, oh, you misunderstand me, it's because you're all racist. Yes, and then when you do call him under, he says, political speech. Except it's not, and it makes individuals incredibly uncomfortable. Why do I highlight all of this? Well, let us not forget that he talked about reconciliation. This language does not reconcile. This language incites. And this, unfortunately, is the hallmark of Julius Malema. And I must say, in 2024, most people don't want to see forms of racial incitement. That's why people aren't voting for his party. It's the very rhetoric that he has used in the past to gain forms of relevance that are now causing his very downfall. And let us end this off by reminding ourselves that in December 2019, Malema said, in the next 5 years, if we have not built a school, don't even elect any of us, because we are useless. And I must be reminded that that school was meant to have been built on the 16th of December, 2024. And the school hasn't been built. And if you ask Malema why it hasn't been built, the answer is numerous. It's COVID, it's planning, it's money, it's restrictions. There are many, many excuses. But ultimately, Malema described it himself. It's because we are useless. And we have to remind ourselves of this. When we see the polemic, when we see Malema calling for forms of racial war, don't be scared. Don't be intimidated. It's nothing more than a tin pot dictator who's still trying to cling for forms of relevance. But the relevance has long since gone. His generals, his soldiers have left him, and he's nothing more than a shadow of his former self. In any case, that's what I think. You can let me know what you think in the comment sections below. Until next time, bye.